The Battle of the Trenches. The reason for this battle was to eliminate the Muslims once and for all. The Jews were the real instigators of hostilities leading to the composing of this alliance. The Battle of the Trenches, or, of Al-Azabi, Confederates, as it is sometimes called, took place in the month of Shawwal, 5 AH. The location was Medina itself. The Muslim force was 3,000 soldiers, where the alliance force were 10,000 soldiers. 7 Muslims laid down their lives in the Battle of the Trenches while they killed 4 of the enemy, and on a cold and cloudy night, a violent hurricane from the desert uprooted the tents of the nomads and overthrew their cooking pots. The severe weather, sent by Allah, disheartened the enemy. The battle resulted in utter defeat for the Quraysh-led alliance under Abu Sufyan and a complete triumph for the Muslims under the great Prophet. O who believe! Remember Allah's favor unto you when there came against you hosts and we sent against them a great wind and hosts could not see. And Allah is ever seer of what do, Quran 33:9. And Allah repulsed the disbelievers in their wrath, they gained no good. Allah averted their back from the believers. Allah is strong, mighty. Quran 33:25. Action against Bani Qurayza. The reason for this battle was the treason of Bani Qurayza for their breaking their treaty with the Prophet, in order to help the Quraysh in their attack on Medina. It took place on the Dhul Qa'dah 5 AH, few kilometers to the southeast Medina. The Muslim force was 3,000 soldiers, and 36 horses. The Prophet and his people surrounded and occupied the district inhabited by the Jewish clan of Bani Qurayza, whereupon the beleaguered Jews defied the siege for 25 days, finally succumbing up to the pressure and then offered to surrender. Bani Qurayza submitted to the Prophet's decision. The decision was made in the hands of an arbitrator which was the chief of Alos, one of the Al-Ansar clans, Sa'd ibn Mu'adh, who gave his decision. I decided that the men should be killed, the property divided, and the women and children taken as captives. All in all, round 400 soldiers of Banu Qurayza were killed. Benevolence and large-heartedness. The Prophet sent some of his men on an excursion into Najd who captured Thumama bi Uthal, the chieftain of Banu Hanifa. When the party returned to Medina, they tied him to a stump in the Prophet's mosque. God's messenger approached him and asked, "What do you expect, Thumama?" He replied, "If you kill me, Muhammad, you will kill one whose blood will be avenged. If you show me a favor, you will show it to one who is grateful, and if you want property, you will be given as much as you wish." The Prophet left him, and when he passed by him the next time, he asked him the same question. Thumama repeated his earlier reply and the Prophet left him again. When the Prophet passed by him for the third time, he ordered Thumama to be set free. Thumama went away to a grove of palm dates and returned to the Prophet, after taking a bath. He accepted Islam and said to the Prophet, "I swear to God, Muhammad, that there was no face on earth more detested by me than yours, but now your face is the dearest of all to me. And, I swear to God that there was no religion more hateful to me than yours in the entire world, but now the dearest of all to me. What happened to me is that your cavalry seized me when I was going to perform Umrah." The Prophet congratulated him and bade him for it. When Thumama reached Makkah, someone asked him if he had turned a disbeliever. He replied, "No, by God, I swore that not a grain of corn will reach you from Al-Yamama until God's messenger accords permission to it." Al-Yamama was the chief market of food grains in Arabia from where the Makkans used to import their requirements. When Thumama went back to Al-Yamama, he prevented the caravans from bringing wheat to Makkah. So the people of Makkah wrote to the Prophet, requesting him to get the ban lifted. The kind-hearted Prophet asked Thumama to repeal the ban and allow the rationing and supply of food grains back to them. Expedition of Banu al-Mustalik and the affair of Ifk. After some time, the Prophet led an expedition up to the hills and went to Dhu Karat against Banu Lihyan in pursuit of some raiders, but there was no fighting. In Shaban 6 AH, he was informed that Banu al-Mustalik were plotting for an attack on him. He went out with a group to face the enemy. A large party of the hypocrites, still skeptical and reticent, accompanied the Prophet, with their leader Abdullah bin Ubay bin Salul. The hypocrites had never before gone out with the Prophet, in such large numbers in any earlier expedition. The failure of the Quraysh in the Battle of the Trench, despite having mustered all the warriors of their confederate clans for the destruction of Islam, had made the hypocrites bitter and sour, indeed burning with hostility in their souls. The Muslims were gaining victory after victory, the star of their fortune was on the rise, and this had sent the Quraysh, the Jews, and their allies in distress. They knew that they could not humble the Muslims in an open combat, and hence the only way to defeat them was by sowing dissension within their ranks and pitting them against one another. They also knew that the only way they could undermine the confidence of the Muslims in Islam and its Prophet, as well as trigger a rift between them, were debasement of the noble Prophet, and arousing pre-Islamic sentiments of tribal pride. With this view in mind, the hypocrites started a clandestine campaign of casting doubts upon the honor of the Prophet. An entirely new type of society had, however, evolved and had been in existence in Medina at such time, whose members loved and respected every other man bound by the common ideal. These pretenders had, therefore, arrived at the conclusion that nothing could sap the foundations of this ideological fraternity more effectively than a slanderous campaign aimed at creating misgivings against the leader and his family. Undoubtedly, this was a well-maneuvered conspiracy of the hypocrites, which was vigorously pursued during the expedition of Banu al-Mustalik, when, for the first time, as stated earlier, a large number of them accompanied the Prophet. The Prophet met the enemy at a watering place of Banu al-Mustalik, in the direction of Qudaysh towards the shore, known as al-Muraisri, where the battle brought Banu al-Mustalik to defeat and exodus from the area. While the Prophet was still at this place, a hired servant of Banu Ghaffar, belonging to the Muhajirin, got into a row with another man coming from the tribe of Juhayna, which was an ally of Al-Khazraj. The Juhini called out, "O Ansar," and the hired servant shouted, "O Muhajirin." Abdullah bin Ubay bin Salul at once flared up and said to his friends who happened to be present with him, "Didn't they dare it? They set themselves against us in our own country and tried to outnumber us. By God, it is just the same as the ancient saying, 'Feed the dog and it will bite you.' I swear by God that when we return to Medina those who are worthy and noble will drive out the unworthy wretches." Then, admonishing his men, Abdullah continued, "You have yourselves to blame for it. You allowed them to settle in your country and shared your property with them. By God, had you held back and not been so generous, they would have certainly gone elsewhere." The Prophet came to know about the incident, and he at once gave orders to break the camp and then set off, although he was not accustomed to traveling at such a difficult hour. He wanted the people to get rid of the vain disputations and provocations of the devil. The Prophet continued to move all day long and braved the night till dawn, extending up to the following day till the sun became annoying. He finally made a halt when the people had become so exhausted that they readily fell asleep as soon as they laid themselves over the ground. Abdullah was the worthy son of the unworthy Abdullah bin Ubay. He rushed to Medina ahead of the troops and waited for his father's arrival. When Abdullah bin Ubay came, his son brought his camel to its knees, thereby obstructing the passage of his father, whom he ordered not to enter Medina until he had acknowledged that he was indeed an unworthy wretch while the Prophet was commendable and noble. In the meanwhile, the Prophet also showed up. He said to Abdullah, "Nay, let us deal kindly with him while he is with us." The Prophet used to cast lots, whenever he intended to go on an expedition, to decide who among his wives should accompany him. In the expedition of Banu al-Mustalik the lot had fallen on Aisha, and she had accordingly accompanied the Prophet. At one of the stopovers in their journey back to Medina, the Prophet spent a part of the night before he ordered to break the camp. Aisha had gone to answer the call of nature, and when she came back she discovered that she had dropped her necklace. She went back to hopefully recover it, but by the time she returned the army had already left. Then the camel drivers in charge of Aisha's transport saddled her covered litter thinking that she was in it as usual. However, Aisha was small and very light, so no one noticed that her litter was empty. When Aisha, may Allah be pleased with her, came back she found no trace of the army, so she wrapped herself in her smock and laid down in the hope that as soon as they would discover the real situation, someone would come to fetch her. Safwan bin al-Mu'addal al-Salam had earlier followed behind the army for a purpose. He happened to pass by Aisha and stopped at her. He saw her. "Inna lillah," he called out, "the Prophet's wife." Then he brought his camel near her and turned back a few paces. After Aisha rode the dromedary, Safwan took hold of the camel's halter and went ahead quickly in search of the army. Safwan overtook the army when it had again rested. Nobody noticed the incident, for such mishaps were not unusual in the caravans trekking the vast emptiness of the Arabian wilderness. To wayfaring Arabs, it was just a familiar misfortune, and their code of honor, even in the days of pagan past, never tolerated the disgrace of their daughters. The Arabs, both pagans as well as after embracing Islam, were chivalrous enough to lay down their lives defending the honor of their women rather than to support any disgrace. A poet of pre-Islamic days expresses the Arab sentiment of chastity and virtuousness in a couplet, which depicts a lovely picture of Arab womanhood. If my glance meets the looks of a neighboring maiden, I cast my eyes low until her abode takes her in. The companions held the Prophet in the same esteem and reverence as one has for one's father, while the wives of the Prophet all served as mothers of the faithful to every Muslim. In fact, never had any people loved anyone so dearly than how the companions cherished the Prophet. Safwan bin al-Mu'addal was, as they say, a man of sterling qualities, noble, true-souled and God-fearing, who had the reputation of being least interested in women. In short, nobody paid any attention to the incident, and the matter would have been forgotten had not Abdullah bin Ubay walked into the picture. On coming back to Medina, Abdullah bin Ubay thought it an ideal opportunity for their plans to succeed, to capitalize on the adversity. He had found out, as he would though, something that he could bank upon to humiliate the Prophet and his household, and thus weaken Muslims' sentiments of love and admiration for him and his family. His treacherous disposition was ample enough to assure him that his shameless attack on the Prophet's honor would create sufficient misgivings to destroy even the mutual trust among the Muslims. And true enough, the crafty conspirator had thus convinced a few circumspect Muslims who were accustomed to jumping into conclusions without verification. Aisha had no idea of the defamation against her. As it normally happens in such cases, she came to know of it very late, and when she did, she was bewildered. Plunged into sorrow, her anguish had kept her sobbing until tears overflowed her eyes. The scandal was even more distressing to the Prophet of God. When he found out the architect of this intrigue, he proceeded to the mosque, and ascending the pulpit he said, "O believers, who would allow me to say something about the man, who I have come to know, has caused trouble to my family? What I know of my family is naught but good, and what they say concerning a man, I have known only good about him. Whenever he enters my house, he enters with me." The people of Oz were filled with indignation at the grief of the Prophet. They said, "We are prepared to behead the man, whether he belongs to Oz or Khazraj, who has given tongue to this calumny." Abdullah bin Ubay belonged to Khazraj, and hence his tribesmen took the remark as an affront to tribal honor. Pent-up emotions reigned until the two tribes were about to grapple with one another, but the presence of the Prophet calmed them down, finally preventing the outbreak. Aisha knew her innocence. She was distressed, but was also confident and composed, so typical of the one who knows that the truth ultimately prevails in the end. She knew in the depths of her heart that God would ultimately protect her honor and bring shame to the slanderers. But it had never crossed her mind that God would send down a revelation concerning her, which would be read in the mosques during prayers, a reality that will abide till the end of time. She had not waited for long when the verses attesting her innocence were sent down by God, hence, "Lo! They who spread the slander are a gang among you. Deem is not a bad thing for you, nay, it is good for you. Unto every man of them will be paid that which he hath earned of the sin, and for him among them who had the greater share therein, his will be an awful doom." Why did not the believers, men and women, when heard it, think good their own folk, and say, "It is a manifested untruth"? Quran 24:11-12. And thus ended the frightful menace, which was forgotten completely by the Muslims of Medina, who devoted themselves once again to a great task which determines not only their own success, but that of the salvation of the entire humanity as well.